G'day, Rod here. Just making a series of short videos on one of my favourite subjects, the 4JX1 diesel engine, which was in the 98 day 3 model Jackaroos. Basically just want to make this video is just going to be a quick how the injection system works. Basically it's a common rail engine, but it's not like a normal common rail engine in the injection system alone. Basically, a normal CRD engine has a high pressure diesel pump which supplies the injectors with high pressure diesel, and when they get a signal to fire they allow that high pressure diesel out into the cylinder. With this engine, the injectors themselves, they get an electronic signal to fire, but the force behind them is actually driven by oil pressure, high pressure. Basically, I just want to explain how the injection system works, so we can talk later about problems and how to diagnose a few of those. So basically the injection system is called a HEUI system. It's HEUI, which is hydraulically actuated electronic unit injection system. It was developed by Caterpillar and adopted by Isuzu for this engine. I think it's the only small diesel engine that it appears in. It's in a few of the engines over in the States, like the engines for the F250s and 350s, that sort of size truck. But basically the HEUI system runs on oil pressure, as I said before, this engine has two oil circuits. Basically it's got a low and a high pressure oil circuit. The low pressure circuit is just for lubrication and cooling like a normal engine. High pressure circuit drives the injectors. There's a few components and there's a path that the oil takes, which I'll just talk about now. So basically when the oil's picked up in the sump, it's picked up through its own oil pickup and it's drawn through a separate oil filter into a high pressure pump. Now that high pressure pump supplies the high pressure oil up into the oil rail, which sits just above the head, and it has the four injectors hanging off it. Now with this engine it still has a fuel rail, but it also has an oil rail. And the fuel rail itself is actually a gallery inside the head, and it's got the four injectors sitting in that fuel. The fuel is actually low pressure right up until the injector fires it into the cylinder. Now with the high pressure pump on this engine, it actually serves two purposes. It's a fuel pump, but it only pumps low pressure, and it's the high pressure oil pump. Now on the back of that pump is a valve called an RPCV, or rail pressure control valve, and that actually controls, via a signal from the ECM, or engine control module, it controls the pressure that gets up to the injectors. When the oil gets up to the injectors or into the rail, the oil rail, there's two sensors on there. One's a temperature sensor for the oil, the other one's an oil rail pressure sensor. Now that sensor sends the actual pressure that's received in the rail to the ECM, and between the oil rail pressure sensor and the rail pressure control valve, they maintain that pressure that's required to atomise the fuel properly in the injectors. So there are a few components in this system, but it's reasonably straightforward. It's just handy to know where they are and what they are, and what symptoms would be if they start to play up. Just a couple of notes. The oil rail pressure sensor and the valve give probably the most amount of trouble. The other component that gives you dramas is the oil pickup down in the sump. So we'll talk about those three in a few other videos that we make, and hopefully that just alleviates a bit of a mystery about this engine. Just to talk about the mystery, a lot of guys and gals that have problems with this engine tend to go to Holden as a first point of call. Unfortunately Holden have sort of lost touch a fair bit with this engine. I suppose once they stopped making the Jackaroos, they're not as interested in knowing too much about them. In saying that, they probably know more than your average garden variety mechanic, because most of those think, oh, it's common rail, it's going to work like a normal common rail does. That's not the case. So if you're going to use a mechanic, you probably need to either get them to do some research or find out if they know anything about 4JX1 or the HEUI system, because what generally happens is they misdiagnose problems that on this engine don't cost that much to fix, but they'll misdiagnose them and they'll start at the wrong end, or they'll start replacing the wrong components, or shut up the thought they will rip the head off or do something strange. It doesn't need to happen, and it will cost you mega dollars to fix. Anyway, that's it for now, and we'll catch up on the next few videos.